from the Indo-Pacific, where Brazilian President Lula da Silva has now spoken about his meeting with the US President Donald Trump at the sidelines of the ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, calling it the most enthusiastic meeting of his schedule in the Malaysian capital. Speaking about the conclusions of the meeting, President Lula said that his American counterpart has promised to make a deal with Brazil amid tensions in the backdrop of the exorbitant tariffs imposed by the USA on Brazil. The Brazilian president has also put forward his willingness to help the USA with its campaign against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, signaling a deeper shift in South American regional geopolitics, as this makes Brazil the first country after Argentina to support the USA in its campaign against Venezuela. Talks between the two presidents also touched upon the trial against former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who Trump was very vocally supportive of as he faces the courts on charges of insurrection. He faces prison time now of over 20 years. Here's what the Brazilian president had to say about the meeting.
Eu estou convencido de que em poucos dias nós teremos uma solução definitiva, sabe, entre Estados Unidos e Brasil, para que a vida siga boa e alegre.
We're once again joined by Ross Feingold. Ross, of course, Brazil faced one of the highest tariffs in the world after some to and fro between Lula and Trump. A 50% tariff, even though Brazil had a trade surplus with the United States. However, now things seem to have thawed, and it was all smiles in Kuala Lumpur. Trump seemed to have promised Brazil a new deal, but with the US still punishing Brazilian exports, who actually holds the leverage here, Washington or Brazil?
It still seems to be Washington. Brazil wants to have a good relationship with President Trump, with the United States, but we have this judicial process with Bolsonaro that has caused a real rift between the current governments of the two countries. The U.S. is also eager to make sure that Brazil, like other countries in the region, don't come too close to China. And that's an area of significant disagreement. Lula wants to maintain an independent foreign policy. He's built a good relationship with China and Xi Jinping and participating in alternative multilateral platforms like BRICS. So it's difficult to see where they could see eye to eye on that issue as well. Frankly, I think whatever nice things that President Lula and Trump might say about each other coming out of this meeting, that might only last a few days. I think it's difficult for these two to be on the same page going forward. So I would expect actually that it's going to be difficult to resolve some of these differences and actually see a reduction in the tariffs.
Ross, a huge topic of conversation recently has been that of the Caribbean, that of the Maduro government. Does Brazil support, legitimize Trump's push for regime pressure in Venezuela? And how will this reshape regional blocs like BRICS, for example?
This is one of those things where, again, I would say that no matter what nice things Lula or Trump say coming out of this meeting, as long as the United States continues its anti-drugs activity in the waters of the Caribbean, it continues its pressure on the Maduro regime in Venezuela, I think Brazil and Lula are going to react negatively to that, and Lula is going to criticize that. And that's going to lead to counter-criticism from President Trump. Really, it's unlikely to expect that Lula would welcome additional sanctions or pressure or even a regime change in Venezuela. That's just not his position. So this is one of those things where the U.S. and the current government of Brazil have very different opinions, and it's very difficult to reconcile those different views.
Yes, and Ross, Lula has historically defended Latin American sovereignty and condemned U.S. intervention, which the United States, of course, has a long history of in South America. What explains his sudden willingness to align with Trump's hardline Venezuela strategy?
Again, I'd be careful about saying Lula is actually aligned with Trump's policies on Venezuela. I think this really remains to be seen. It's probably safer to assume that Lula is going to revert to criticizing U.S. intervention or pressure and to take the side of Venezuela. On the other hand, Lula claims to be somebody who cares about democracy and cares about human rights and the rule of law. And one cannot say they support democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and then be supportive of Maduro's regime in Venezuela. The two positions are inherently contradictory. And that's one of the things that Lula struggles with, because on the one hand, he doesn't want U.S. intervention in the region. On the other hand, he knows what a terrible despot that Maduro is.
Yes, indeed. And of course, the Bolsonaro factor. Donald Trump went so far as to put sanctions on the judge who was adhering to Bolsonaro's trial. How awkward is this meeting politically, given Trump publicly backing Bolsonaro, and given that verdict, now Bolsonaro has been found guilty?
Well, again, whatever nice things the two say about each other coming out of the meeting, we have to deal with the reality. The reality is that this judicial process is playing out. There'll probably be appeals that will take a lengthy amount of time, but in the interim, there's this guilty verdict, and Trump vehemently disagrees with this, and he's made his criticisms quite public, including the sanctions on the judge that you referred to. And there's no meeting of the minds on this. You know, Lula could say that Bolsonaro is a terrible person, but I can't interfere in the judicial process. The judiciary is independent. And President Trump is going to disagree with that. And President Trump is going to make his views very well known, whether he does that on Truth Social or via the State Department. And I think the two guys are just going to revert to their original back and forth disagreements in statements and social media.
Ross Feingold, it's always a pleasure to talk to you and have you on the program. Thank you very much for taking the time. Argentinian President Javier Milei's La Libertad Avanza party rebounded from a series of setbacks to take 40.84% of the votes cast for members of the Chamber of Deputies and Senate, according to official results based on 90% of votes counted. The Argentine president has hailed his party's runaway victory in the midterm elections as a turning point for the country and vowed to charge ahead with his agenda of shrinking the state and deregulating the economy. He promised to continue on the reform path with what he predicted would be the most reformist Congress in Argentina's history. The President Donald Trump, a close ally, congratulated Milei and said his Argentine counterpart was doing a, quote, wonderful job. Let's take a listen in.
Hoy claramente ha sido un día histórico para la Argentina. El pueblo argentino decidió dejar atrás 100 años de decadencia y persistir en el camino de la libertad, el progreso y el crecimiento. Hoy pasamos el punto bisagra. Hoy comienza la construcción de la Argentina grande.
Now, in Georgia, hundreds have taken to the streets of Tuslibee to mark 1 year since the country's disputed parliamentary election. Protesters accuse the ruling Georgian Dream Party of winning through fraud, echoing claims made after last October's vote. Demonstrators waved Georgian and EU flags, calling for democracy and closer ties with Europe. Opposition leader and former President Salome Zourabavishvili said most Georgians remain firmly pro-European and want democratic reforms. Authorities had responded forcefully to protests last year, and tensions between the government and opposition continue to simmer. Let's in fact listen in to what the former president of Georgia and some of the protesters had to say.
The vast majority of the population has always been and remains pro-European, wants democracy, wants independence, doesn't want to become a Russian colony. And that is a responsibility also for the European Union. It's a responsibility for us and we're standing there because of that, but it's also a responsibility for our partners.
ბოლომდე იმიტომ რომ ერთ-ერთი გამოსავალი იმ მდგომარეობაში რომელშიც ჩვენ ვართ არის ბრძოლა იქამდე სანამ რეჟიმი არ ჩამოიშლება ბრძოლა ერთიანად და ერთად გონით ერთი ძალისხმევით სადაც ყველა პარტიები იქნებიან სტუდენტები იქნებიან ყველა ის ადამიანი რომელსაც უკეთესი მომავალი უნდა ამ ქვეყანაში დადგება ერთად სწორედ ამის ეჩინია რეჟიმს
ალბათ ესეთი ერთიანი ერი არ ყოფილა იმისთვის რომ გვინდა ევროპული მომავალი მხოლოდ და მხოლოდ მშვიდობიანი გზით და ასევე აუცილებლად უბრალოდ წარმოუდგენელია ამ მთავრობასთან ერთად ამ ქვეყნის ევროპული მომავალი. ამიტომ ასევე ჩვენი მოთხოვნა არის ამ მთავრობის გადადგმა.
ფაქტი რომ ქართველი ხალხი ყოველთვის მისი ასე ვთქვათ პროგრესული ნაწილი ვერ შეეგუება იმ უსამართლობას, რომელიც დღევანდელ საქართველოში არსებობს და ამის მთავარი მიზეზი არის საქართველოს დღევანდელი ხელისუფლება, რომელიც ყველანაირად მაქსიმალურად ებრძვის საქართველოში დემოკრატიას.
Well, that is all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from across the globe.